just want to start out maybe when you initially took the interest in the Fox program and issue.
I think I first started to take an interest around 2003. I'd been pretty busy. I'd been overseas in 2002, and I came home, and I think that Bernie Fox, the roadkill, Bernie Fox really got me pretty interested to knowing whether that was a legitimate roadkill, and the sense of how it had been detected, how it was responded to, and what were the findings from the pathologist. So that was the beginning, and I sort of sensed that they were looking for a belief that it was definitely a roadkill, that it had this timeline, that somebody had run over it, then a cyclist had found it, they'd reported it to the police had come, put it into a box and taken it to their station, and then alerted the task force. So it sort of had this cascade, and then there was publicity with Brian Greene getting involved, all that sort of thing, and then the pathology report saying, was the findings would have been consistent with roadkill. Well, yes, it was consistent. It had blunt. I think it had blunt trauma consistent with roadkill, which yes, you could say that, but in a sense, I wasn't convinced because of the whole association being so in Burnie, being close to the wharf, the fact that there'd already been an escaped fox in 1998, and then started to really realise that potentially this animal could well have been a plant or an animal that had been killed and then placed there. And I raised that with the pathologist. He said yes, he couldn't discount that possibility. So I then started to email Nick, and Nick really confirmed by email that they'd had really substantial problems with dealing with wharfies and stevedores and the Patrick's employees generally, and that they were, a fairly crazy bunch. And so, on the basis of just that sense of uncontrollability about the responsibility that other people were taking for that issue, and the fact that it almost seemed like the government was giving the impression that there was a resident fox population, and I was saying, the dogs are going to come in very soon, and we're going to have a full blitzkrieg on the whole area to find where this animal's been hunkered down, or whether there's other animals there. And that was when I think one of the dog handlers found he was stymied for several days before he was allowed to go up there and help. And then I think he finally resigned and blew the whistle on the fact that he had been held back.
I'm not familiar with that story.
Oh, really?
No, who was...
I'm just trying to remember his name. I think his name was Wright, Wright, and he came out, and the minute he came out basically saying that he thought the program was not dealing with follow-up investigations on high impact or high credibility incidents was the concern that he had, and that he cited this instance of the fact that they delayed so long that any scent trail that this animal would have had couldn't be followed through. And so I can't remember his first name. Ken Wright.
Yeah.
That's it, Ken Wright. So then it became a bit of an argy-bargy. I think he retired or resigned a year or so later, and he was a bit of an explosive media storyline, and the minister came out basically saying he was a disgruntled former employee and blah blah blah. So put him down, and it all went to ground. So I think that was the one that really got me going, and I thought, well, okay, I am going to take an interest in following, because it started to look like there was a continuation of sightings right across Tasmania starting to come in. Media was relatively constant. There was money coming from federal and state sources to support a task force. They were beginning to think about baiting on a grand scale. They'd got the cooperation of the TCT and the Tasmanian Greens and quite a number of the opposition parties that said, well, the fear of foxes is really serious, that biosecurity needs to be tightened, and that biodiversity would be under threat. So I just started to watch fairly carefully after that.
I suppose from there, if you look back, you see sort of a pattern of events as far as taking a long time to deal with reports and incidents.
Yeah, I mean, you look back in retrospect and most of this starts to fit into a pattern that you probably weren't really aware of, or you gave them consideration for saying, well, maybe they've got a lot on their plate, and you gave them the benefit of the doubt. But looking on it, I'm now of the opinion that it seemed more like it was not a reason, it was an excuse for just letting things limp along, like giving the sense that there was something out there, but we were never able to get there quick enough, or we didn't get the follow-up testing done quickly enough to be able to determine what could be done in that area because they had this basic thesis that somehow the biology of the fox was that wherever they had begun to establish themselves, they would be looking for mates, and therefore they would be rampant dispersing animals that were moving hither and thither across the countryside. And yet the premise of their whole beginning of their program in 2001 was on the basis of this referral from, it's a fairly long sort of process of sources and informants, but it was effectively saying that a tip-off had been alleged that fox cubs had been imported into Tasmania in several litters over several years, some successfully, some less successfully. They'd been reared in some covert location to adulthood or to independence, and that they'd then been released at 3 to 4 different locations. And so that was the sort of sense that you had a malevolent act that then dropped animals that had been reared in captivity into the wild, and presumably in some sort of pairings of males and females, but that was not known. And that this was the basis of the sighting records that were happening around Campania, around Oatlands, Campania, St Helens, Longford, and potentially Burnie. So they were sort of mooted as the 4 points, 4 locations. So, I mean, you just take a big gasp and you say, is this really... if that has happened, it's the most treacherous form of as it was said, environmental terrorism that you could possibly consider very, very malignant act of treachery, bastardry against Tasmania's ecology. But it really needed to be validated. And I guess the sightings, all the sightings did, which were coming in subsequently, were that they were the places that were the locations, but we didn't get the full story until Llewellyn released his fox plot in 2002.
Well, what's your opinion on that? Do you think the sightings were... you've just put it around the other way, actually.
Yes.
Because often when there is a report that there are foxes in an area, that people start seeing them.
Exactly.
You've just said it the other way around.
Exactly.
So how do you account for that?
Well, I guess this is where the complexity of the story is very important, is that before I was involved in any way as a pathologist or a risk assessor from the point of view of biosecurity, and a senator for Tasmania called Shane Murphy had, as a hunter and a person who was pretty close to the ground with understanding of, I guess, rural politics and rural issues of concern, he had approached the police department and requested FOIs in 2002, saying, well, what is the basis of this whole palaver? Because he said, why are you thinking that you've got apparently you've undertaken some investigation that has now been dismissed. I would like to see the background. So he got the FOI, and the FOI had all those all the allegations, the claims, and the confidential briefing note that was the basis of Llewellyn being given information that suggested that this cascade of events, importation, rearing, release, had occurred. And all that was covert to the public. The public was not aware of that. All they knew that, I think at the end of July 2001, they knew that the police investigation had not been able to corroborate any conspiracy of individuals to do this on the basis of the names given. So it just so happened that at the same time as that was being reported very small in a small little item in the newspaper, we had all these reports of big fox hotspots at St Helens, and the Longford Carrick area was becoming a problem, and getting more referrals from places like Oatlands and down south in the Colebrook area, Colebrook and towards Richmond and that area. So I mean, if you wanted to, you sort of ask yourself the question: what was the chicken and what was the egg? If the government was privy to this information that was then dismissed by the police, then in a way the sightings that they were reporting, were they an objective assessment of real presence of foxes, or were they a subjective validation of where they wanted foxes to be? Because there were when you look at their sighting records, there's sighting records from places like Strawn and at one stage at Cradle Mountain and right down the Forestier Peninsula and into the Tasman Peninsula. So you're sort of thinking, well, if these are sort of put on their public record as what they call highly credible or excellent or highly reliable sightings, they just sort of had these spurious criteria. You think, well, you need to have some validation as to why you would make them meritorious enough to say their sightings sufficient to say they're fox. And that was the problem, was that for every sighting, you wouldn't expect every sighting to be followed up, but where you got a cluster of relatively credible sightings from people who had a reputation for being good bushmen or good farmers, or people who could give you a very, very detailed description of what they saw, how many times they saw it or whatever, and then you came in and you followed up on that cluster of sightings, then you would have a sense of validation, corroboration, and you say, my goodness, not only did 5 people say they've seen a fox, but we've actually seen a fox and we've found fox sign, and we're now putting in the technology we have to actually validate it by showing that there's a picture or something. And that was the problem that I had, was that over all the years we've had sensationalism on sensationalism, and a lot of reportage of the sightings that people have seen. How many sightings every year, and it became something where you didn't know what was driving the agenda, whether it was coming out of the general community de novo as being valid and authentic, genuine sightings, or whether it was almost like a copycat herd mentality of saying, if somebody's seeing a fox, well, what I saw the other night might have been a fox, and then it sort of reinforces, which is the thylacine story of Tasmania.
It is absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, from the start, there was a problem with the way the task force reacted to the reports and stories, and early on there were some issues with some of the people that were recruited. Yes. And how they dealt with these, dealt with the tasks that they had.
Yes. I think if you go back to that 2001 period when they had the referral of what was considered to be a bona fide fox sighting by Chris Spencer on Illawarra Road in mid-May, and that was a reference that Nick Mooney or some sort of recorded message was left, and they then followed up on that. It was the initial response from Llewellyn was that this was a single fox that was at loose, and it seemed then that they introduced some older information that occurred in earlier May that had suggested that a woman who was an employee of the department or former employee of the department had presented a picture that she claimed had been taken from the back of Wynyard of a fox in a close to a tree plantation. And so these stories became one where you had the Burney photograph incorporated with this new sighting of one fox or a fox on Illawarra Road, and then this need to respond, and there was a lot of panic and response in the community with people seeing foxes and chicken coops being raided and foxes being caught in chicken coops and then running away, and scats being found, hair being found in barbed wire, letters being sent to task force people to tell them where to look, Victorian fox hunters coming over with scent dogs, etc., etc. It just became a sort of a really big frenzy, and that was the time when they took reference from a number of experts from the mainland, and this is where Dr. Clive Marks and I think to some extent Tim Bloomfield got involved, but Clive Marks initially, and the thing, Clive had no contact with me at all until 2008 or 2009 when I went before the Pack Inquiry, and he asked me to go back and give him some background, because he'd gone on the record in support of the whole program, saying this was a very serious eco-terrorism impact, and that it needed to be taken seriously if this had happened. He actually teed up the ABC Catalyst program and got them to do a full story on it. And what convinced Clive, and this is what he's told me, was that he was presented with some information that suggested that the department was privy to the knowledge that there was a location that had foxes there that had been kept in captivity, and that there was some footprint of some buildings or pens that had been recently demolished, and he was shown either one picture or several pictures that were taken of what had been a site. He took it on face value. He said, look, and they told him that there was also an investigation that was going on, a police investigation that was a full CIB investigation that was called by the police minister, and they were going to follow up on named individuals. So he thought, well, this is pretty serious.
Yes, he would.
And so what happened was he actually gave them the biggest tick of the lot by adding his name and then putting it into the Catalyst. Jonica Newby came down and did interviews with various people, and it got put onto the profile of the national agenda as a serious biosecurity problem. So that's where, when he came into it, he was feeling pretty I think concerned that he may have been led down the garden path, because he was trying to get corroboration that this demolished pen issue was part of that police investigation. No, it hadn't been. Had anybody done any forensics to demonstrate there was any fox sign or fox debris, fox product that was there? Were these people likely to have had a record that related to the inquiry that was originally begun by the police? And this is where he found himself stymied, because he couldn't get any clarification. So from that point of view, this is something like 8 years down the track, 7-8 years down the track. he's starting to feel like I'm feeling like I might have been set up here. Now, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it was a sense that he was coming to a deja vu understanding of something that we had already, appreciated, that it didn't add up because, and he was a fox ecologist that was looking at how foxes were either covertly in an urban landscape and going undetected, or how you could find them at low densities, high densities, how you could use a DNA test usefully, either diagnostically or forensically. So I mean, he had all the skills, and yet the minute he'd done his sort of cameo act, he was sort of relegated to the sidelines.
Just going back to that property, has it ever been established why those things weren't followed up? I mean,
No.
I've looked into it.
No, not at all.
And no one seems to have any answers. The police sort of passed it off as if it wasn't their responsibility, as do parks. They go back and forth.
That's the case everywhere.
I mean, if it was taken so seriously, that it's quite unbelievable that.
Well, it's the prima facie thing that they were running with. I mean, the whole thing. See, my background is with diseases that we don't want to have in Tasmania, like foot and mouth disease or swine fever or rabies, rinderpest, things that we may get here through tradable product or through somebody doing something illegal and bringing in something that contains the organism, and then it establishes here. And the first thing you need to know is that you've got an index event, something that is prima facie, that you know has happened, that's likely to have caused an explosion of a new disease, or that you've got clinical signs, you've sent it off to a reference laboratory, it gives you confirmation, and then it has to go through a validation process where every other CVO around the countryside says, are you sure this is right? Have you checked that the laboratory's giving you the right test? Are you sure the clinical signs? Have you got somebody else to check the test as well? And then they say, well, because this is a serious issue, we have to raise it with international people because it's a trade barrier. Whereas Tasmania, with foxes, it was really a state issue because every other part of Australia has foxes. So we were sort of left without that level of surveillance or that checking that said, how clear are you that you have this problem? Because the issue that the Greens picked up on very early was, if you had an escaped fox in 1998 that was clearly escaped off a freight ferry that was crossing Bass Strait every few days, and it was coming from a high-risk area where foxes were present, then you would have to consider biosecurity as being the number one source of a potential threat. So they said, well, if you've got slack biosecurity and your quarantine control is poor, then that's the basis of beginning an index investigation. But whereas the government jumped on this humongous, unbelievable sort of suggestion that a group of individuals had done this, and they had whelped fox cubs onto bitch dogs that would have gone through quarantine without being detected, and somehow they were then reared up successfely to the stage where they could be released into captivity, into the wild.
Complicated story, really. Where did it all come from?
Well, I mean, I'm exhausted sort of talking about it now. What appeared to have happened from this confidential briefing note which Shane Murphy received from Lupo Prins, the Assistant Commissioner of Police, was that a conversation had occurred outside of what was then an all-goods shop, an outdoor hunting shop in Glenorchy. And the conversation had been between an individual coming out of the shop and a person who was admiring his vehicle with, I think, a Kelpie dog on the back. And it transpired that that they started to talk about where they deer hunted and etc. etc. The conversation went into other things, and the allegation is that this source of information, the primary source, claimed that there had been an attempt to introduce foxes. The reference point was that this conversation had occurred at about the time of a Collingwood-Carlton football match. That you can follow up and find out when that was, and it appeared to be sometime in May of that year, and that this source said, oh, well, what they'd done was that they'd brought these animals in and they'd reared them, and he named, allegedly, it is claimed on this confidential briefing note that he named names and pack drills of exactly what happened. So this then, it turned out that the primary informant, the person who got this information, was the brother of a Parks and Wildlife ranger. And it is claimed that he then transferred, this all came out because the FOI documentation reveals these individuals. It's then claimed that he passed that information on to his brother, the Parks and Wildlife official, who then took it up the chain of command to the higher echelons of Peewee, of Parks and Wildlife, which was to Peewee, and they then said, well, this is the basis of a significant issue that needs to be followed up. Minister Llewellyn was not only Minister for Primary Industries, Water and the Environment, but he was also Police Minister. So he had the authority to delegate to the police and say, I want you to do an inquiry. Now, we have no date on when that confidential briefing note was given to the Minister. It's not an undated briefing note. And so it's speculative. But it became the reference for the beginning of the police investigation that had about 5 individuals involved in it.
Was the primary source actually speak again with the police, or was
Yes.
it just through the involved?
The primary source was never, I believe that it was never contacted. The primary informant was.
Right, so the primary source no one has...
I believe not.
Right.
So we have a primary informant, we have a secondary informant who's the Parks and Wildlife officer, and then we have a cascade of it going right up to the Minister, who then refers the matter on for formal investigation. And that takes them about 6 weeks.
Because why I ask is, my understanding was that the informant actually refused to speak after a while, so that's why I assumed it would have been the initial source.
This is the difficulty with the FOI documentation has blanked out quite a number of names, but these documents have been given to different people at different times, and the blacking out has not been similar in all documents.
Right.
So sometimes names have been missed. I'm not saying that I'm convinced that it's the way I'm saying it, but it appears that the brother team that were the primary and secondary informants were the ones that were given most of the grilling, because you can get that impression from the way it's been described in the FOI diary entries of the interrogators.
But if they had no connection to the people that actually
Exactly.
did the thing, why would they be concerned about...
I think all I can think of is that the police were trying to get a chain of custody worked out, that this was a bona fide, valid referral. But of course, I'm still unclear, and that's where I guess Ivan Dean would be the best person to talk to, or probably Michael Otley, who was the senior detective inspector, to say, did they actually talk to the primary source? Because the primary, the impression it may well be that I'm incorrect, but at one stage in the documentation there is a sense that, I think that's right, there is a sense that they interviewed that individual, the primary source, but that I don't think they take a statement from him, but he makes the comment that he is astonished at the level and degree of detail that seems to have come from what he considers to be a very, very casual referral to a casual conversation with this Parks and Wildlife
Right.
brother of a Parks and Wildlife chap. So what he finds is that, oh my God, now all this is sort of coming up as a big operation where the police are starting to get involved, and he backs off. He really backs off at 100 miles an hour, and the police are left with the sense that they've got names that have come from somewhere. Who knows whether it was the primary source is now denying it, or from another source, and they go. The police make every effort to attempt to ascertain the veracity of that, and they can't. And they finally work through the process, and they come to the conclusion that it is hearsay and innuendo that cannot be. There's nothing that is in the motivation or intention or any of the record keeping of these people to suggest that they did get involved in anything of such an elaborate nature.
Given everything you've seen on this, are you convinced that the police did enough? Or
well,
that it's that they fully followed up these things?
I mean, I can only go on what I've been told about the reputations of some of these. Some police I've talked to have been pretty critical of some of the officers involved, and they have been less than congratulatory of their capacity to do a thorough investigation. I think Michael Otley's reputation as a senior detective inspector is beyond reproach, and so I would say that I would feel that he would have a very good sense whether he was being bullshitted too, or that there was more into it. So could they have done more? Yes. I think once they had run down these 4 individuals and they had nothing to go on, and there was nothing coming in from anybody else saying there was another plot, or there were other people that should have been, because they weren't dobbing in anybody else saying, "Oh, don't finger me. It's not my, go and talk to Charlie down the road." It was more like, I think these people were genuinely astonished that they had been identified.
Yeah. Well, this is running concurrently with the Parks and
Yes.
the Rangers investigation.
Yes.
And at some point they.
That's right. Well, there was this.
So-
This was with Glenn Atkinson.
Yes.
Well, this is where Glenn becomes part of that grouping that is involved in reporting back on the formal police investigation, and there is a sense that they were following up on a particular trail of their own, and it seems like this is where the story gets confused, because I don't know whether any other names were mentioned, whether any other, because it was, if it did broaden out to a larger group of sambar deer shooters that were occasionally going across to the mainland, and there were some grievances that they had about gun laws and banning certain weapons being used, then I certainly wasn't aware that was being part of that initial police investigation. I think they were pretty much restricted to doing what they were told to do, and that was to say, does this have legs? Do these people have have a reason to have done this, and can you corroborate it with showing that their properties are contaminated, or that they have records going to the mainland which would suggest that they would be fitting in with these timelines that have been alleged.
Didn't find anything.
No.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think we've covered all that.
I'm sorry, it was a bit mucked up there, because I'm just trying to think back through those papers, and they're very. You've got to go through them meticulously. I've worked through them with several police officers, and they're of the opinion that they're detailed. You can certainly see the process of events that took place, or the alleged events, and what the police did. But for police to be so adamant in their final, dismissal, was to me a pretty amazing thing, because usually, if police sort of don't really know, they want to be cautious. Whereas this, when Dean wrote to Jack Johnson, the deputy commissioner, and then that went up to the commissioner of police at the time, and then on to Llewellyn. They were pretty strong letters saying there's nothing here. There's nothing.
Yep. It always appeared to me that there were two separate investigations going on, and I mean, I've had this confirmed by other people that the parked people were quite put out that the police came in and ruined their investigation because they felt they were quite close to uncovering these things.
Well, that's the difficulty, and that's where this concept that Llewellyn introduces somewhat down the track is the statute of limitations. Somehow saying, well, we do know, because he came out in 2002, June 2002, saying, well, we do know that this was a bona fide malevolent act of bastardry to introduce foxes and release them. And the only thing that stops us from taking these people before the courts is the statute of limitations. Well, it's almost sort of cute. It's sort of satisfactory from the point of view of saying it's giving an explanation that so our hands are tied, but we know these people have done something malevolent. Well, I can accept that to a certain point, but at some point you would think that you would want to be able to demonstrate that out of that basis of what you thought was a true factual thing, that you actually found evidence that had actually happened. And that was where the Jack Kinnear report was just so critical, because when he was the first reviewer of the program, and from what I can get from the chronology that was given to him by Chris Ems, he was given the same pack drill, that this had happened, this had happened, and from what I can paraphrase from what he's saying is, well, if you think this has happened, and you know that you've got a finite number of animals that are likely to be introduced into these locations, you've got to first of all demonstrate that they're there. You've got to be able to use an effective tool to remove them. And you've got to be able to show that you've removed them, and you've got to keep it up for sufficient length of time to know that you've got them all. And he said, if you can do that, I give you you probably have a window of 3 years in which to contain them to locations where they feel are their habitation zones where they've been released, and you're gonna have to go for it. Mm. So
going on that information, can you talk a bit about how that was hampered as far as getting the resources and the funding required to deal with if this event had occurred? They seemed to be quite slow getting things moving, and they were restricted by a certain general manager.
Well, I must admit that the general manager involved was a person that I'd had experiences with when I was in the department, and I had my own impressions of his ability to be a leader, and a person who inspired trust and confidence. But independent of that, it was a Machiavellian hierarchy, and people really didn't know who to trust. The trouble was that these general managers were given fairly large portfolios of responsibility, and in that period of time from the late 90s into the early 2000s and new millennia, cost cutting was still going on in the department, and they were looking for other cash cows to sort of basically hitch their cart to. So biosecurity was seen to be a luxury, something that was probably you could say we're clean, green and clever and disease free, and we keep these diseases out, and we want to give the impression to the world that we're fantastic. But it was really tokenistic. So what they would do would be to try and cut back, and I guess this is the problem, is that when you have cutbacks and people feel that they're being sold down the river, so to speak, or there's treachery at higher echelons, then people aren't happy about that. So you can go back and look at the budget papers and see where the cutbacks occurred, but it appeared that when this Fox issue came up, it seemed like it was a new cash cow, because the government could annex a threatening process, a key threatening process that was acknowledged under the EPBC Act, to an organism, namely the red fox, that shouldn't be here. And it was a responsibility at a national level that it should be controlled. So I think, it was very, I guess, opportunistic or serendipitous or downright malevolent that they would go to the effort of trying to convince their counterparts in Canberra that this was a bona fide, real deal issue. And whether the general manager had a very serious, involvement in creating that scenario, I can't say, because you've talked to Tim Bloomfield, you've talked to a number of others about this, and their responses to him as an individual. He tended not to be at the forefront of any of this. He was a backroom boy, and he wanted to stay that way because he was really advising the minister and the secretary of the department, Kim Evans. But the funding did come. The pressure was relentless. Llewellyn just relentlessly hounded, first of all, Senator Robert Hill and then David Kemp to get this money. And it became a situation where it was all in the media every day. It was like, the argy-bargy is getting even more tetchy, and the minister is denying that he ever received a proper application for funding, and then etc. etc. It became farcical, but it was a game that had to be played out politically to get the money, and they got it in dribs and drabs. 400,000, then I think got up to 700,000 for another tranche of money, but I think the feds were always cautious.
There's a lot of criticism about how the money was spent early on.
Yes.
They went out, they got lots of guns and things.
Infrared sights and
all sorts of appropriate things. And a lot of it.
Yeah, new four-wheel drive vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
have you looked into that much? Can you talk to that?
Not at all. The only thing that I got aware of was that I'd started to do some work with a graduate student at the university on feral cats, and we were looking for access to feral cats for the purposes of looking at the diet and the impact of feral cats on biodiversity declines. And Sally Bryant, who was the threatened species manager, said, look, there's quite a number of cats that are in our freezers. The Fox Task Force boys around Cressy, Longford, the Simmons Plains, Epping Forest, they're shooting cats, I should say cats, all the time. These feral cats are available. They're all frozen. At some stage we'd like to do something. If the grad student's interested, they can have them. I said, well, fantastic. There was something, I think 300 cats, 300. So they were going out at night and shooting. And of course, this is when I think Nick Mooney came out and said, shooting's not a good thing, because shooting will deter foxes from putting their head up, because they'll hear the noise and they'll go to cover. But the feral cats were just out there in large numbers, and and I remember Alex Shapp at the time being very, very critical of feral cats ever being talked of as being a significant biodiversity problem for Tasmania, because the public enemy number one was the fox, and he wanted to diminish the Greens proposition to put up legislation for feral cat control and responsible ownership for pets and stray cat management, etc., etc. So it seemed like this was a paradox. You have a freezer full of cats and no foxes, and people with guns out there shooting in the areas that are considered hotspots. So we asked for these cats to have a look at, and all of a sudden the freezer broke down and all the cats had to be dumped on the tip. 300 cats had to be dumped on the tip. So this was then raised by Nick McKim in the Parliament, and they were told, that's how it is. So that was, I guess, for me, another case of skullduggery or stupidity, or a situation where they wouldn't allow anybody to do meritorious research on the impact of wildcats in the environment, and the fact that, and they were told then subsequently not to shoot cats any longer. So the program, it was an embarrassment for the program. So I guess I didn't go into how much shooting up was going on. I knew there was some concerns about landowners feeling that they were seeing, spotlights being trawled along roads and guns going off, and they were getting pretty uptight about that and reporting it. And that was played down until it got into the media a couple of times. Mm. But and I think Ivan Dean raised it a couple of times that firearms had gone missing, some ammunition had gone missing, that somebody was under inquiry, a member of staff was under inquiry. So I'd sort of seen shenanigans like that in that department before, and I just saw it as a real failure in leadership.
Yeah. So, I mean, what came next was I suppose a different approach once the other evidence started popping up.
Yep.
And what year did the baiting start?
It probably started, I think, in about 2004, 2005. They were certainly testing baiting around that time, looking at whether they had baits that were going to be attached to trees or that were hanging somehow, so that it wouldn't attract other animals that were potentially likely to be exposed. And a number of volunteers who were involved with wildlife were asked to trial different baits that were non-lethal, but just to see, how they were working with other species of wildlife. So yeah, that was when it began. And then I think they got the approval, and it was about that time that obviously the Commonwealth was really interested in getting the CRC involved, the Invasive Animal CRC, and the group at Orange with Glenn Saunders and Chris Dickman from the university in New South Wales got involved, and it sort of looked like they were getting to the risk management side of things, saying, well, we know there's foxes. But coincidentally, it was 2004 was when there was criticism from the community started to increase, and it looked like even the department was saying that there was a reduction in sightings were happening. So, and Evans put out a letter to the paper saying, bear with us, the program is sort of really in rundown now. We've done what we have to do. I think they'd already started some baiting by then. I think it was 2004, 2005. Anyway, he came out basically saying, it's on decline. We've reached the peak of sightings, and now it's declined. And he stated this quite categorically, and it was reported in the budget estimates as well. So it was as if we're sort of on the run down, and then everything went haywire in 2006. Everything just blew up again.
Yeah. Well, there was 2005 with the Lillico Beach.
Well, Lillico Beach was, late 2005, but it wasn't reported until 2006.
You're right,
Yeah. So 2006 had three significant incidents. The Lillico fox cub macerated remains that was found in February. Then the alleged blood that was found at a chicken coop where there was multiple chickens killed at Old Beach on the eastern side of the Derwent, and that was in May. And then in August, 1st of August 2006, we had the Glen Esk roadkill fox. So that just changed everything blew up again. It was all...
Yeah. Well, all those were been over them many times, and there does seem to be a lot of question marks about the official reports and how they've changed over the years and everything. Is there anything to be gained from going over the...
Not really.
Again?
I stand by the position I took that really they overcooked everything. And they went out of their way to build a story into something that was very sensational and extremely appealing to journalists. It created a lot of copy over many, many days on each one of those incidents. It created wonderful theatre, including, having bodies reconstructed in the post-mortem room to create the sense that it had not even been touched, and yet the post-mortem had already been done. There was things to me that were quite deceptive. There were some dishonest statements being made. I raised them with the PAC inquiry in 2009. As a pathologist, when I saw they put a young intern pathologist on to do this significant autopsy on the Glen Escort fox, and he was keen and eager, but he was out of his depth. There was no doubt about it. His reportage was limited. There was a senior pathologist that could have done it, and he didn't take any involvement in that. And when I saw the pathology report, I requested to see the slides. I saw the slides, and I realised that there was quite a significant amount of what we call post-mortem autolysis. This is decomposition and breakdown of cells, invasion with bacteria, and it's what you get when an animal's been dead for quite some period of time. And so we had this paradox of them claiming one thing, that this animal had been still warm and floppy at the time when it was found, and that the serendipity of two parks officers turning up and being able to do this finger thermometer trick of telling how warm the animal was on a cold day, and then determining through a soil probe thermometer that it was still warm, etc., etc. It became farcical, and as I say, the slides told me that this animal was dead for longer than 24 hours. It was probably longer than 48 hours. It had probably been, the rigor mortis was not instantaneous. It hadn't gone into rigor mortis. The animal was floppy because it had gone past rigor mortis. It had once an animal within between 1.5 to 3 hours after death, depending on exertion, etc. And physical muscularity of an animal, will go into rigidity as you get what you get anoxia, because there's no longer a perfused circulation.
But wouldn't they have realised when it didn't go into that after they found it?
They should have. They should have.
And they didn't.
They didn't.
Click. Okay. And was there ever? Sorry, just to stop to say. Was there ever an explanation why the junior pathologist was put in charge?
No. Luckily I had access to the full photographic record and the timing of all the pictures that were taken from a CD that was sent to me. So I was able to confirm that these were authentic pictures that were taken at certain timelines, and it didn't add up. Nothing added up on this case. The pathology didn't add up. Then when finally Gary Davies came out 2 days later, because I raised the matter on Tasmanian Times, I said, look, if somebody's knocked over a fox and killed it, it should be up to that person to come forward. Well, it just so happens that person allegedly did come forward. We'd give them a call, and so on the Thursday of that week, I think it was the 3rd or the 4th of August, Gary Davies puts out this very strange press release saying, a person had contacted the department and that he had run over the fox. It had come from one side of the road and crossed over. He'd knocked it, realised that he'd hit the fox. He got out, checked that it was a fox, and drove on. And that was at this time of 8:30 in the morning. Well, it all sort of fitted in with the storyline that had already been put out a couple of days earlier, on the basis of what the two people who initially found the fox had said, that when they detected it, the agricultural drivers, and then corroborated with some of the other testimony that was subsequently given. But the problem was that this animal had been dead for a lot longer. So I kept on harrying them and saying, you know, I really think that there's problems, so I asked to see all the records, etc., etc. And this is the difficulty I had with the transparency of the officials involved, was that it became clear that they were convinced of their own argument, and they didn't want anybody to question it because it had already gone into the media. Everything was there convincingly, but it just didn't add up. And really, it's about the physical. When an animal goes into dies and goes into decomposition, the clock starts ticking, and changes do occur. And what happened was then the stories changed. And when I gave a full report to the minister, I think about the middle of 2007, I said, you know, I had my concerns. They then commissioned another pathologist to look at the material. He agreed that the animal had been killed, had been dead for longer than 8:30, but he wasn't prepared to accept that it had been the timeline that I said 2 or 3 days. And it then left this sort of contention between experts, but it was clear that the 8:30 incident could never have occurred, so that it questioned the veracity of Gary Davies' press release, whether this person who had approached them was lying or making a story up. And then we have Nick Mooney claiming that they had evidence, I think he gave in the PAC inquiry, that somehow that they had information from another source that the animal had been killed the previous day at another property at Epping Forest and transferred there. Well, the premise of my report to Llewellyn was that the time of death, the cause of death, and the location of death were wrong. So I mean, I felt like I was. It was like this. It was just like a slow train wreck happening here, and clearly this was a huge piece of evidence. It was a huge piece of evidence. And what then happened was, on the back of that piece of evidence that was found there, I think I think the previous October they had found a scat at Kanara, October 2005. And then in about September, October of 2006, they found 5 scats around the Kanara area. So, you know, if I was an ordinary Joe Bloggs, I would have said, well, you've had a dead fox, you've had Bosworth shooting a fox at Symonds Plains, you've got this dead fox here, you found a scat, then you find 5 other scats, you've got problems. Now, you know, I could accept that I was wrong, and the thing that really shocked me was when Steve Cronin approached me, and when I was starting to get some publicity, and he said, "Dave, I have seen a fox at a property near there called Brambletire." And I said, "Yeah, Steve," and I knew Steve. He was Parks and Wildlife Ranger, had worked at Mount William National Park, and we'd known each other. We'd worked in the Environment Centre at Launceston for many years together. I'd always respected him, and if he said he saw a fox, I would believe him, and I do believe him. So he said, I made that referral to the department and to the task force, and I said, yes, tell me about it. He said, I'm going to take you there, and we spent 2 days there, and we trekked over the area. He said, this is where I saw the fox, this is what I was doing. I was doing a survey for Forester kangaroos. I had binoculars. I saw this fox for several, tracking up through this bank. It stood and looked at me because he could see that where you know that I was coming, etc., etc. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I reported it to the Parks and Wildlife and the task force. They came out. They did exactly what we're doing now. We looked for sign. We didn't find anything. And I said, well, that's all very interesting, Steve. That the trouble I have with this is that it was never reported in their official log of sightings. It's as credible as the sighting that Chris Spencer saw, as far as I'm concerned. He's a person of the highest merit in terms of his ability to detect animals, identify animals.
But why?
Why? Why?
Yeah.
And I don't know. There's two possibilities. There's two possibilities that I entertain. One is that this was another fox that was introduced as a result of freight forwarding from the mainland that escaped. At the time when this whole fiasco happened, Tasmania was in record importations of feed grain for feeding of stock, sheep and cattle, because we were in drought, and they were bringing in consignments by truck. It wasn't coming in as bulk haulages in one shipment and then taken into silos at Devonport. It was coming in single haulage trucks. And some of this feed grain is low quality and contains rodents, a lot of rodents. And one speculation that was given to me by one of the freight forwarding people involved in grain handling and other agricultural freightings said that they were concerned about importation of not only weeds but also vermin and presumably foxes. So he said, the risk was that foxes could have been coming straight off the toll boats, straight off even the spirit, and being taken directly to a property, and then being opened up and because they just have a net across the top of these large containers where the grain was, and if there was a fox there, it would jump and go bush. So that was one possibility. The other thing that was concern to me was at the time when this program got going, in 2002, there was the proposition put up by Tim Bloomfield and others of the red hot mamas, and that was this issue of releasing animals that were potentially acting as decoys to release physically vasectomized or neutered foxes. In other words, they were spayed, but they had their hormonal capacity to attract, and that either by radio collaring or radio tracking, they could actually find the other animals. This was a venture that was being trialled by a number of people, including Clive Marks, and all I can think of is the reason why the Parks and Wildlife didn't want to report Steve Cronin's bona fide sighting was that it was embarrassment that biosecurity was breached again, because Bramble-Tyre was a sheep farm that was importing grain. And the other problem was that if they had done anything covertly to introduce animals that had been vasectomized or desexed into the landscape, they wouldn't really want it to be made known. The only thing is he didn't see a collar on it, suggesting it was a tracking animal, an animal that would have some sort of... Whether he was able to see that, I don't know. But to me, that is the greatest enigma because...
Have you asked anyone from the program about that?
No, I haven't. All I know is that at about the time when this all happened, Llewellyn changed the law or changed the regulations to allow for bulk importations of grain into Tasmania, into the Grain Elevators Board silos at Devonport, so that and it was a very big challenge to the freight forwarders because they were getting a lot of money through the freight equalisation program of bringing over single shipments because they were getting cash for this, all the transportation cash. Whereas now, what they were doing was doing these short haulage runs from the grain elevators silos in Devonport to farms. So and of course that was the most biosecure method of trying to prevent foxes getting to Tasmania. I don't know whether that makes sense, but to me that to me was the biggest enigma of knowing that single foxes, and then of course the whole issue was that Spencer fox in 2001 was claimed by the FOI statutory decks that the police did get was a fox escaped from a container being unloaded at the AgFest agricultural show in 2001.
Which also fits in with the timeline with the footprint and the sounds that the English couple heard as well.
Yes.
So could have just been.
Yes.
And I mean, there has been a whole history of single incursions.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's to be expected, isn't it?
And that's and nobody's disputed that. I think the 1998 one was real. I think Spencer's one was very likely, was real, based on the corroboration of these reported. Because when I raised this with Nick Mooney, I said, look, there's 3 statutory declarations, and he said, oh, it's just pub talk, Dave. And I'm saying, but Nick, people don't make statutory declarations before members of the police, and sign them. You don't do that, because you are going to find yourself in big hot water if this finds out that you're a fabricator, and that
what would be a motivation?
What would be the motivation to do it? So really, you've got single foxes that have caused issue of being sighted, and followed up with repeat sightings, and then you've got this story of multiple importations.
Yeah. So, are you satisfied at all that enough or has been done towards biosecurity as far as foxes go? Do you think that they've taken the right sort of steps? Because, I mean, there's been so much focus on eradication, probably to the detriment of other things. Do you...
Probably not. I mean, 2008 they put out a report on the biosecurity response to foxes getting into Tasmania, and they looked at the main sites like Bell Bay, Devonport, Burnie, and Hobart, and they did a risk assessment of the threats that were coming in, the frequency, and what their barrier quarantine was likely to be, their inspection capabilities, and it was very much a tokenistic document in a way, because it really relies on people's responsibility to take it seriously. And from what Clive and even Tim and others have said about what was happening at Webb Dock as the stevedores, and at that stage you'd just come out at that really serious conflict with Patrick's and all the stevedores being very, very narky about losing access to award rates and having to do all this efficiencies to get work and extra hours. So there was an issue there, and the problem was that foxes were part and parcel of the sort of the wharf ecology, and people were getting hamburgers and Kentucky Frieds and feeding foxes, and occasionally foxes were enticed into containers and doors shut behind them, and dunnage containers, that's empty containers that were returned to Tasmania, could well have contained foxes that were brought in. So there was issues like that really said, Tasmania has to have a watching brief for biosecurity for foxes forever and a day, but the thing is that it's more likely to be these silly, spiteful, single fox hysterical incidents, rather than something that says that you're bringing in males and females that have the guile and the wit to set up the ability to begin. And with the whole issue of biosecurity and entry establishment and spread of a new threatening process like a fox, is that they usually have to create a beachhead somewhere. They come in somewhere and they localise and then they spread. In this case, you've got the scenario where they've said somebody's actively by human commission brought these animals in, reared them covertly, then released them. Now, you must talk to Clive whether those animals are going to be much more easy to pick up in the landscape because they're habituated in some way with humanity. Are they going to be more easily sighted, or are they going to be skittish and run for the hills? I don't know. I'm not a fox ecologist, but it seems to be a very important thing to work out, because 9 to 11, 11 to 19 fox cubs were claimed to have been released in that period.
Yeah, but I mean, finding out as much information about them as possible would be the first thing you do, really, to try to map where they go and
Yes.
what sort of behaviour, and none of that really seems to have happened. Well, probably couldn't happen really. And just on biosecurity, I mean, one of the most basic things, I remember going through old newspapers and seeing how many times Nick McKim brought up in Parliament fences around Burnie Dock.
Oh, they were just a
really
joke.
Basic thing.
A joke.
Which just didn't get done.
No. Well, it was like rubbing their nose in it. This is the difficulty I have with this government. It's become a political fox hunt more than anything, because it's a bit like the embarrassment of what they were doing and what storyline they were selling to the people of Tasmania, and what the whistleblower politicians, whether it was the Greens or whether it was, Ian Rist sort of telling stories that were contrary to what they were claiming. It was always about embarrassment. It was about saying, well, we're in control, we know what we're doing, and we just flick those stories off. That's nonsense. It's ridiculous. So if you've got the power, you're right, and if you haven't got the power, you're weak and you're wrong. And I guess this story is symptomatic of that Machiavellian play.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. I'll just have a break. The lights changing a bit. So.
Yep.